The storm that night did not feel ordinary. It wasn't the kind of rain that passes quickly, washing streets clean. No, this was the kind of storm that pressed its weight onto the city, turning the sidewalks of downtown Atlanta into rivers of glass. Neon lights blurred against the wet asphalt, headlights smeared across puddles like broken stars. People hurried beneath umbrellas, determined not to look down, not to notice the shadows they stepped over. And there, on the marble steps of the Ritz-Carlton, a girl was on her knees. Her hoodie clung to her thin frame, soaked through until her skin showed beneath. She was no older than 16, her face hollow with hunger, her hands trembling as she clutched a torn medical folder to her chest. The storm beat her down, but her voice still rose through the chaos, breaking with each desperate cry. "Please, help me. My mother's dying. She's pregnant. Please, someone, please." People walked faster. Their shoes clicked across the polished stone, their eyes glued to their phones, their umbrellas angled to block the sight of her. To them, she wasn't a girl, she was a problem, a reminder of something they could ignore as long as they kept moving. But the truth could not be ignored forever. From the curb, a black limousine purred to a stop. Its back door opened, and out stepped Ethan Whitmore. Billionaire. Philanthropist. Man the newspapers called Atlanta's golden architect. His suit was pressed, his shoes untouched by rain, his watch a glint of cold fire beneath the awning lights. For him, the storm seemed to part, leaving his world untouched. The girl raised her face to him. Her eyes locked onto his like a drowning hand reaching from the waves. He froze. For the first time that night, Ethan Whitmore did not feel untouchable. In her hands was a photograph, creased, faded, the ink running from rain. A woman lay in a hospital bed, belly swollen, eyes closed, tubes dripping from her arms. The woman's face struck Ethan like a hammer. Something in him shifted. Something buried deep clawed its way to the surface. The girl's voice broke again. "They won't treat her unless I pay. She doesn't have much time. Please, you have to help." The silence between them was heavier than thunder. A valet cleared his throat, uncertain. Guests whispered behind gloved hands. The storm raged on, but within that circle of marble steps, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the photograph again, and memory clawed at him. He had seen desperation like this before. He had lived it, years ago on the south side of Chicago, when his mother sent him to beg outside corner stores because the rent had swallowed their last dollar. Hunger had a voice, and it was the same voice he heard now trembling in this girl's throat. But no one here knew his past. He had built walls of glass and steel, walls of power and silence, to keep that history sealed away. Yet tonight, those walls trembled. If you've ever witnessed desperation ignored in plain sight, you know how it haunts you. Comment where you're watching from, because in some cities, in some neighborhoods, this still happens every night. The girl shifted closer, dragging herself on her knees across wet stone. Her folder slipped, pages scattering into the storm, lab results, hospital rejections, overdue bills sliding across the marble like broken truths. Each sheet was another wound, another scream in silence. She scrambled to gather them, but the storm snatched them away. Ethan's security guard leaned in. "Sir, want me to move her?" The girl's voice cracked again, louder now, cutting through the murmurs. "You can save her. You have everything, please, don't let her die." Her words clawed at him like iron hooks. Behind his stillness, Ethan's chest tightened. Why did her face feel familiar? Why did her pain look like a mirror? The storm pushed harder, wind whipping umbrellas sideways, lightning clawing at the sky. The girl's hoodie clung like a shroud, her lips trembling so violently she could barely shape words. And then she whispered something so sharp, so quiet, only Ethan could hear it. "You're the reason she's dying." The guard stepped forward instantly, ready to silence her, but Ethan raised a hand. He stared at her, the weight of her words hitting him harder than the storm. What did she know? How could this homeless girl possibly connect him to her mother's suffering? He thought of his corporation, of the hospitals his board funded, of the endless contracts and backroom deals. He thought of the lawsuits settled quietly, of the whistleblowers whose voices never reached daylight. His empire was built on silence, and yet here, on his hotel steps, silence had found a voice. What would you have done in her shoes, kneeling in the storm, risking humiliation, begging strangers who would rather look away? Comment where you're watching from. I want to know if you would have had the courage. The girl's hands shook as she lifted the photograph again, pressing it against his chest. Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs that rattled her thin shoulders. Her tears mingled with the storm. "She's all I have. Please, don't let her die with that baby." The baby. The word hung in the air like a blade. It was not just a dying mother now, it was two lives balanced on the edge of a stranger's decision. The storm hammered down, drowning out the world. Ethan stood frozen, his face pale, his mind racing. Did this girl know his past? Did she know the history of his company? Or was this all coincidence, a cruel trick of fate dragging him back into the darkness he had clawed his way out of? The valet shifted again, uncomfortable. The hotel staff whispered, their eyes darting from the billionaire to the girl. Everyone felt the weight, the unbearable tension of a choice too heavy for one man to carry. And in that silence, Ethan realized something terrifying: this was no accident. She had come here for him. She knew more than she had revealed. The storm pressed on. Her voice trembled into the night. "You're the only one who can stop this. Please. If a truth this heavy was whispered in your direction tonight, would you have the strength to face it? Comment where you're watching from. I'll be watching for your answers." The thunder roared overhead, drowning the city. The girl stayed on her knees, soaked, broken, but unyielding. The billionaire stood above her, haunted, silent, his polished shoes splashing in the water at his feet. One girl. One photograph. One accusation. And a painful truth still locked behind trembling lips. Before the storm, before the marble steps of the Ritz-Carlton, Kayla Johnson had a home. It wasn't grand, it wasn't new, but it was theirs. A one-bedroom apartment tucked into a crowded Harlem block, its cracked walls alive with the hum of neighbors' televisions, the laughter of children spilling from the hallway, and the occasional late-night arguments that bled through thin plaster. For Kayla, that place was a fortress. A fortress built not from bricks, but from her mother's voice. Angela Johnson had been a nurse. Her white shoes squeaked across hospital floors, her back bent from 12-hour shifts, her heart always too big for her body. She would return home with swollen ankles and tired eyes, but she always saved her smile for Kayla. The smile that said, "We're going to be okay. I'll carry this weight so you don't have to." But one night, everything changed. Angela had uncovered something inside the hospital, a ledger buried in digital files, records that didn't add up. Supplies ordered in bulk but never reaching patients. Drugs missing from inventories. Treatments billed but never given. And deeper still, experimental procedures performed quietly, with no patient consent. The hospital wasn't a safe place anymore. It was a machine chewing through lives. Angela spoke up. She thought truth would protect her. Instead, it destroyed her. Within weeks, whispers spread among her supervisors. Her hours were cut. Her shifts replaced. Then, a pink slip landed on her desk like a knife through the chest. Kayla remembered that day. Angela walked home in silence, her hands trembling around the paper. She dropped her badge on the kitchen counter, sank into the couch, and whispered. "They'll never forgive me for speaking." It wasn't long before the bills piled up. Rent notices pressed against the door. Angela's savings bled into medical debts when her pregnancy brought complications. And the hospital that fired her refused to touch her case. They branded her a traitor. For Kayla, the fortress crumbled brick by brick. If you've ever seen the ground pulled from beneath your family overnight, you know the silence it leaves behind. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how close this feels to your own streets, your own city. But there was a detail Angela never told anyone, not even Kayla. The pregnancy wasn't born of love. It wasn't planned. One night, in the shadow of the very hospital that cast her aside, Angela had been cornered by someone with power. Someone who knew her silence could be bought, or forced. When she resisted, they took something she could never give. The child inside her was proof not of joy, but of violence. Kayla discovered fragments of this truth later, piecing together words her mother mumbled in fever, words that didn't match the story she had always told. And though Kayla never dared to ask outright, the weight of suspicion pressed on her chest every time she looked at her mother's belly. Angela's health declined fast. The pregnancy drained her strength, the stress shredded her immune system, and soon, what little money remained was spent on medication she couldn't finish. They pawned jewelry, sold furniture, even Kayla's schoolbooks. And still, it wasn't enough. When the eviction came, Kayla held her mother's hand as they stood on the sidewalk surrounded by their things in trash bags. The neighbors pretended not to see. Landlords never looked twice at the tears of the poor. That night, they slept in a shelter, the air heavy with mildew, the sound of coughing echoing through the dark. Kayla never forgot the shame of pressing her mother's swollen belly against her side to keep her warm while listening to rats scurry across the floorboards. If you've ever lost your home, even for a night, you know it marks you forever. Comment where you're watching from, tell me if homelessness is something your city hides, or if it lives in the open. Kayla adapted faster than a girl her age should have. She begged at train stations, sang outside subways, scraped together coins for meals. But nothing ever stretched far enough. Angela grew weaker, her belly heavier, her breaths shorter. Still, her mother whispered, "Don't give up on me." And Kayla didn't. But behind every effort, behind every desperate prayer, a single thought haunted her: who would help them? Who could? That was when she began to notice Ethan Whitmore's name. It was on the hospital's boardroom letters. On the funding reports. On the donations plastered across New York's medical district. Every corner of the healthcare empire seemed tied to his corporation. His face smiled from magazines stacked in waiting rooms they could never enter. To the world, he was a savior. To Kayla, he was the man standing at the gates of the empire that had thrown her mother into the gutter. It was then she made a choice. She would find him. She would confront him. She would force his eyes to see what his power had done. And so, Kayla followed rumors of his travels, news of his galas, his hotels, his charity dinners. Weeks of searching ended at that storm-drenched night in Atlanta, where fate brought a homeless girl face to face with the billionaire she blamed for everything. If you've ever believed the powerful live untouchable lives, ask yourself, what if one cry from the streets dragged them into the same storm they created? Comment where you're watching from. I want to know if you believe power can really be confronted. Now, on the marble steps, Kayla's accusation was not random. It was sharp, pointed, aimed straight at Ethan Whitmore's chest. For she had lived the collapse of everything he claimed to protect. And Ethan, haunted by his own buried past, stood frozen, wondering if the girl's words were coincidence, or if the empire he built was finally coming back for him. The storm was only beginning. The gala should have been the perfect night. Crystal chandeliers burned like captured stars inside the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, glasses clinked, violins swelled, and Atlanta's elite circled the room like predators disguised in silk and diamonds. Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of it all, host, benefactor, untouchable. His empire glittered as brightly as the champagne. Yet even surrounded by gold, his mind was still outside in the storm. The image of Kayla on her knees, her voice raw and breaking, clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Every toast, every handshake, every hollow congratulations from his peers was drowned out by the memory of her eyes. Eyes that accused him of crimes he had never admitted, not even to himself. He slipped away from the noise, past velvet curtains and into the quiet of his private lounge. The city stretched before him through floor-to-ceiling windows, towers rising like monuments to his power. But he no longer saw them. All he saw was a girl in the rain, whispering words that cut deeper than any rival could. "You're the reason she's dying." He poured a drink, though his hands trembled more than he expected. The amber swirled in the glass, catching the light like fire. He had built his empire on control, every deal, every headline, every carefully managed scandal locked in place like gears of a machine. And yet, one desperate girl had shattered that control with a single plea. Ethan thought of his childhood on Chicago's South Side. A mother bent over 2 jobs. Nights spent in hunger, the sound of neighbors screaming through thin walls, the endless fear of eviction. He had promised himself, even as a boy, that he would never live powerless again. But Kayla's eyes told him he hadn't escaped. He had only traded places. He had become the man standing at the gates, while others begged outside. If a story like this can unravel a billionaire's image in seconds, imagine how quickly power can vanish when truth slips through the cracks. Subscribe now, because what comes next is something most people will never see coming. A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts. His head of security stepped inside, stone-faced. "Sir, about the girl. We looked into her. Shelter records place her in Harlem until 3 months ago. Medical debts tied to Angela Johnson. She's real." Ethan's jaw clenched. Real. Not a con, not a scam. A living wound standing on his doorstep. "Dig deeper," he ordered. "I want everything, school records, hospital files, the mother's history." Quietly. "No leaks." The guard nodded. "And the girl herself?" Ethan hesitated. His chest tightened with something he refused to call guilt. "Keep her close. I want to know if she shows up again." When the guard left, Ethan sank into his chair, running a hand across his face. He had spent decades burying the boy he once was, building walls of glass and steel around him. But tonight, the walls felt thin, and the ghosts pressed close. He told himself it was curiosity that drove him. A matter of control. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was recognition. The girl's desperation was his own reflection, dragged back from the past he had sworn to forget. And for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore was afraid. Not of losing money. Not of boardroom rivals, but of the truth that might already be clawing its way to the surface. Because if Kayla Johnson knew even half of what his empire had buried, then one girl in the storm might be enough to bring the whole tower crashing down. Most people think wealth protects you, that power shields you from consequence. But stories like this prove otherwise. Don't miss what happens when the shield breaks. Subscribe now so you're here when the truth is exposed. Ethan turned back to the city, his drink untouched, his reflection fractured in the glass. For years, he had convinced himself the past was behind him. But tonight, with Kayla's voice still echoing in his ears, the past was standing at his door. And it was not leaving. The city never sleeps, but hospitals dream in a language of machines. At night, their corridors hum with fluorescent light and the low beeping of monitors, the air thick with antiseptic and whispered urgency. For Kayla Johnson, Mount Hope Hospital was more than a place of healing, it was the shadow that had swallowed her mother's career, the machine that had turned their lives into ruin. Now, dressed in borrowed scrubs too big for her frame, Kayla slipped through the employee entrance with her hood pulled tight. The badge she carried had been lifted from a laundry cart hours earlier, a nurse too tired to notice what went missing. It was a flimsy disguise, but it was all she had. She kept her head down as she passed reception. Nurses hurried between stations, their faces drained from double shifts. Orderlies pushed carts of supplies, doctors murmured behind glass walls. No one looked twice at her, and that anonymity was her only protection. Every step carried weight. This wasn't survival anymore. This was confrontation. Somewhere in this building lay the proof that her mother had not been crazy, that she hadn't lost her job because of insubordination or incompetence, but because she had stumbled upon something darker. Kayla turned down a dim corridor, her sneakers squeaking on waxed floors. She passed signs pointing toward archives, toward staff-only doors. The deeper she went, the colder it felt, as if the hospital itself were warning her to turn back. At the end of the hall stood a locked door with a frosted window, records and storage. Authorized access only. Her stolen badge clicked against the reader. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a sharp beep, the light flicked green. The door unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, the shelves lined with boxes and folders stacked in uneasy towers. Computer screens glowed faintly, left on by clerks who trusted the night to guard them. Kayla's heart hammered as she moved between shelves, scanning labels, her fingers trembling. She found her mother's name on the third row, a thick file bulging with reports. She slid it free, opened the first page, and froze. It wasn't just termination papers. There were notes scribbled in the margins, warnings about disruptive behavior, about confidential information breached. But deeper in the file, tucked between performance reviews, she found copies of internal complaints Angela had filed. Lists of missing supplies. Reports of altered patient records. Signatures of doctors approving treatments never performed. Kayla's chest tightened. This wasn't incompetence. This was theft. Lives stolen, money pocketed, care denied. But there was more. At the bottom of the file, she found a sealed envelope marked Confidential, Research Division. She tore it open with shaking hands. Inside were memos describing experimental procedures conducted on vulnerable populations. Notes about data acquisition tied to grants. And at the bottom of each page, in fine print, the funding source, Whitmore Healthcare Group. Her blood ran cold. Ethan Whitmore's name, branded across every page. The truth was worse than she imagined. Her mother hadn't been destroyed by chance, she had been silenced by a system feeding profit into the very empire Kayla had confronted on the hotel steps. The air shifted. A floorboard creaked. Kayla spun, her heart slamming against her ribs. Standing in the doorway was a man in a suit, his silhouette sharp against the light. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a nurse. He was security. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, dangerous. Kayla shoved the papers back into the file, but the pages slipped, fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. She backed away, her legs trembling. I was just. The man stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "That file doesn't belong to you." Kayla turned and ran. The corridor stretched like a tunnel, her breath ragged, the file clutched against her chest. Behind her, footsteps thundered. Lights flickered past in a blur. She burst through swinging doors, past startled staff, her heart screaming louder than her lungs. She rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a nurse pushing a cart, and dove into a stairwell. The echo of pursuit followed. She pounded down flights of stairs, clutching the folder, praying the badge would still get her out. At the bottom, she shoved through an exit, stumbling into the night. The air was damp, heavy with the city's exhaust. She ducked into an alley, pressed herself against the wall, and tried to still her breath. The file pressed against her chest like a heartbeat. She hadn't imagined it. The experiments, the funding, Ethan's name, it was all real. If the truth inside those pages ever saw daylight, the empire standing over her would fall. And with it, the man she had begged only nights ago. The danger of carrying such truth is simple: once you hold it, you can never go back to ignorance. And once others know you hold it, you're no longer just surviving, you're hunted. Subscribe now, because this is where survival ends and exposure begins. Kayla pressed deeper into the shadows as a flashlight beam swept across the alley. Security had followed. She crawled behind trash bins, holding her breath as boots scraped across wet pavement. The beam passed, fading into the night. She waited, every muscle aching, until silence returned. When she finally moved, it wasn't toward safety. It was toward confrontation. She knew where she had to go. Ethan Whitmore had to see this file with his own eyes. Not because she trusted him, but because he had no choice anymore. His name was on every page. But Kayla also knew the risk. Delivering this file meant revealing herself, placing her life in his hands. And she couldn't shake the question: was Ethan a savior, or another piece of the machine that had crushed her mother? She pulled her hood tighter, stepped back into the night, and vanished into the current of the city. The file pressed close to her ribs, heavier than any stone. She wasn't just carrying paper. She was carrying a loaded weapon, the kind that didn't fire bullets, but shattered empires. Most people never see the machinery behind hospitals, the silent gears that decide who lives and who dies. But tonight, Kayla had seen it. And she knew one thing for certain: her mother's suffering was not an accident. It was engineered. And the man she had begged in the storm was standing at the center of it. The shelter was colder than the storm outside. Drafts slipped through cracked windows, rust-stained pipes moaned in the walls, and the fluorescent light above flickered like it might give up at any second. On the far cot, Angela Johnson lay curled beneath a thin blanket, her breathing shallow, each inhale dragging like a stone uphill. Kayla sat at her mother's side, clutching her hand, her fingers tightening every time Angela's chest hitched. The file she had stolen from Mount Hope rested beneath her jacket, heavy against her ribs. She had read the pages again and again, each word cutting deeper. Experiments. Theft. Funding signed by Whitmore Healthcare. Her mother hadn't been paranoid. She had been silenced. Angela stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she tried to smile, tried to offer the comfort she had always given, but the weight of illness pressed it back down. "Don't worry," she whispered. Kayla bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. "I'm going to fix this. I swear." But she wasn't sure if she was making a promise or telling a lie. The sound of coughing spread through the shelter, a chorus of suffering that filled the air. A volunteer moved between cots with a tray of thin soup, but Angela shook her head when it was offered. Her stomach couldn't hold anything down. Kayla knew waiting here was the same as waiting for death. She had no money for care, no time to waste. The file under her jacket wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. And there was only one man who could be forced to listen. She stood, pulling her hood tight. "I'll be back," she whispered to her mother. Angela's weak hand reached for her, but Kayla slipped away before her eyes could ask questions. The lobby of Whitmore Tower gleamed like another world. Polished stone reflected the glow of chandeliers, fountains whispered in perfect rhythm, and men in tailored suits moved with quiet precision. Security guards scanned every visitor with sharp eyes, yet when Kayla stepped inside, dripping from the night, all they saw was another desperate figure to be removed. Until she pulled the folder from her jacket. "I need to see him," she said, her voice breaking but firm. "Ethan Whitmore. He knows me. Tell him Kayla Johnson is here." The guard frowned, ready to dismiss her, until his gaze flicked to the file in her hands. The words "confidential," "research division" stamped across the folder froze him. He muttered into his radio, and moments later, another guard approached, escorting her through steel doors into an elevator that hummed upward into silence. By the time the doors opened, Kayla's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might shatter the walls. The office stretched before her like a throne room. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city glittering below, rain washing the glass in streaks. At the far end, Ethan stood with his back to her, one hand resting on the window, the other clutching a glass he hadn't touched. "You came back," he said without turning. His voice was calm, but beneath it was tension, stretched like wire about to snap. Kayla stepped forward, holding out the file. "You need to see this." He turned, his eyes falling to the folder, then to her face. He didn't move to take it, but the flicker in his expression told her he already knew. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "I found the truth," she shot back. "You think you can hide behind towers and suits, but your name is on every page. My mom lost everything because she tried to expose this. She's dying because of what your empire protects." Ethan finally stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is carrying that? Do you even understand what you've taken?" "I understand enough." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I understand that while you stand here in glass palaces, my mother is lying in a shelter bed choking on her own breath. And if she dies, it's because men like you decided profit mattered more than people." The words hit him harder than he expected. His jaw clenched, but behind his eyes flickered something unguarded: memory, guilt, fear. He reached out, hesitated, then finally took the file. He flipped through the pages, each word slicing into him, confirming what he already suspected but had never dared to confront directly. When he reached the last page, he closed the folder slowly. "You shouldn't have this." Kayla's voice rose, sharp and furious. "Then fix it. If you have any shred of decency left, you'll help her. Right now." Ethan's silence stretched. He turned back toward the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass like 1,000 watching eyes. He thought of the board, of shareholders, of the empire built on numbers and silence. To acknowledge this file was to set fire to all of it. And yet, behind the glass, he saw her again, kneeling in the rain, eyes burning with desperation. He saw himself reflected in her face, the boy who once begged on streets that forgot his name. For the first time in decades, Ethan Whitmore felt cornered. Wealth convinces men they are untouchable. But stories like this prove that one truth, carried by the right voice, can bring even the strongest empire to its knees. Subscribe now, because the next move in this story is the kind that changes everything. Kayla stepped closer, her hands trembling. If you don't help, she dies. And so does your secret. Because I won't stop. I'll take this to the press, the police, whoever listens. And then your name won't mean savior anymore, it'll mean killer. The words hung in the air like a knife. Ethan turned slowly, his face pale. For a moment, the mask of power slipped, and what Kayla saw was not a billionaire, but a man haunted by choices stacked higher than any tower. He set the folder down. Where is she? In the shelter, Kayla whispered. She doesn't have long. Ethan exhaled, long and heavy. Get her ready. I'll send an ambulance. Quietly. Kayla blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. You mean it? I don't have a choice, he muttered, more to himself than to her. But even as he spoke, shadows loomed in his mind, the board, the partners, the empire that would not forgive weakness. By saving Angela, he wasn't just risking money. He was declaring war on everything he had built. Down in the shelter, Angela stirred violently in her cot, her body racked by another wave of pain. Volunteers crowded around, unsure if she would survive until morning. And in the tower above, Ethan Whitmore stared at the file on his desk, his reflection fractured in the glass. One girl had forced him to this edge. One dying woman was about to cost him everything. And for the first time, he wondered if saving her life meant ending his own. If you think the cost of truth is survival, you're wrong. The real cost is power, and once it slips, there's no taking it back. Stay here, because the moment that cost comes due will leave no one untouched. The boardroom sat like a fortress above the city. Walls of glass framed the skyline, but inside, nothing shone. The table stretched long and polished, its surface reflecting the faces of men and women who had built their wealth on silence. Ethan Whitmore had stood at this table for decades, steering deals, shaping markets, crushing rivals. But tonight, as he entered, the atmosphere felt different. The eyes that turned to him were not deferential. They were sharp, suspicious, measuring. At the far end, Victor Hale leaned back in his chair, hands folded neatly over his tailored suit. Hale wasn't just another partner, he had been Ethan's ally since the earliest days, the one man he trusted when ambition threatened to devour everything. Tonight, however, there was no trace of loyalty in his eyes. Only calculation. We need to talk, Victor said, his voice smooth, almost casual. About Mount Hope. About the girl. The words struck like ice. Ethan didn't sit. He remained standing, his hand gripping the back of a chair as though anchoring himself. How much do you know? Victor's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. Enough. The file she took. The record she shouldn't have. Angela Johnson's complaints. And your little promise to send an ambulance. The others shifted in their seats, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Ethan's chest tightened. He had ordered silence. How had the board already learned? "You've made a mistake," one of the directors said sharply. "The moment you intervened, you exposed us. That girl should have been contained, not indulged." Ethan slammed his hand against the chair. The sound cracked through the room. "She's a child. Her mother is dying. And you expect me to stand by while our name is dragged through their blood?" "Don't dress it in morality," Victor cut in smoothly. "You're not saving them. You're risking us. Every headline, every investor, every political ally we've bought will turn the moment those files reach daylight. You think your compassion is noble? It's suicide." The words hung heavy, cutting deeper because they were true. For years, Ethan had believed the empire was his creation, his control. But looking at the faces around the table, he realized something he'd ignored: the empire wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them, to the collective hunger of those who had invested in silence. And they would protect it with claws and teeth, even against him. Victor leaned forward, his eyes locked on Ethan's. "You should have destroyed that file the second it touched your hands. Instead, you let it reach your desk. That tells me you're compromised." Ethan's voice dropped, rough and low. "Compromised by what? By remembering I was once the one outside in the rain? By seeing myself in her eyes? If that's compromise, then maybe you've forgotten what it means to be human." The room erupted in whispers, some mocking, some fearful. But Victor's voice cut clean through the noise. "You've forgotten what it means to lead." Silence followed. Heavy. Unforgiving. Ethan paced slowly around the table, his reflection moving across the polished wood. He stopped behind a director who refused to meet his eyes, then another who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "You think silence will protect us," Ethan said. "But silence is the reason we're here. Angela Johnson saw the truth and you buried her. Now her daughter carries the proof in her hands. And you want me to kill it? To erase them both? How long before the next one rises? And the next?" No one answered. But their silence said enough. The board didn't want solutions. They wanted containment. Erasure. Victor finally spoke, his tone colder than ice. "If you can't do what's necessary, Ethan, someone else will. And the empire you built will move on without you." The words cut deeper than betrayal. They were execution. If power can turn allies into predators overnight, imagine how quickly trust can collapse when truth enters the room. Subscribe now, because what happens next will prove how fragile loyalty really is. Ethan's fists tightened at his sides. For years, Victor had been his brother-in-arms, the man who toasted their victories and stood shoulder to shoulder through wars of finance and politics. Now, he sat across from him as the sharpest blade aimed at his back. "Don't do this," Ethan said, his voice low but trembling with anger. "You know what's in those files. You know she wasn't lying. We can't keep pretending this empire is untouchable." Victor's eyes narrowed. Empires aren't built on truth. They're built on survival. And if one life, or two, must be lost to keep this machine alive, then that is the price. You knew that once. What changed? Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The image of Kayla kneeling in the storm, the sound of Angela's labored breaths, those were the only answers that mattered now. The directors began to rise, murmuring among themselves, the meeting dissolving into shadows of threat and conspiracy. Victor remained seated, his gaze locked on Ethan like a vulture waiting for weakness. When the last door closed, Ethan finally sat, his body heavy, his reflection fractured in the polished table. He stared at the folder lying unopened before him. One file. A handful of papers. Yet it weighed more than the empire built above it. The betrayal had cut clean, but it also clarified something. He was no longer one of them. And the cost of stepping away was everything. Most people think wealth makes you free. But the truth is, wealth builds chains heavier than poverty ever could. Subscribe now, because breaking those chains is where this story turns from power to survival. Ethan closed his eyes. The board had chosen silence. Victor had chosen betrayal. Now the choice was his. Save Angela and Kayla, and lose the empire. Or bury them, and lose himself. Either way, the boardroom would never be the same. The shelter always got quieter right before midnight, as if exhaustion pressed a finger to every mouth. The vents hummed, the exit sign buzzed, and the city's noise outside softened to a far-off lull. Kayla had learned to sleep lightly, half dreaming, half listening for the rasp of her mother's breath. Tonight, that breath came thin and ragged, scraping the dark like a match that wouldn't catch. It happened fast. Angela's fingers twitched once, then curled tight. Her body arched with a sharp, involuntary cry that cut through cots and blankets and whispered prayers. Kayla lurched upright, the world snapping into hard focus. Her mother's eyes were wide and unfocused, sweat beading along her hairline, the blanket kicked to the floor as another spasm shuddered through her. "Mom." Kayla's voice cracked. "Mom, look at me." A volunteer jogged over, then another. Someone shouted for the supervisor. Someone else already had their phone out, thumb trembling over the keypad. The air smelled like bleach and damp clothes and fear. Kayla slid one arm under her mother's shoulders, the other across her belly, as if she could hold everything inside by sheer force. The contractions rolled in, brutal and close together. Angela's breath broke into fragments, two sharp inhales, a gasp, silence, repeat. The supervisor pressed a towel to Angela's forehead and forced her own voice to stay steady. "Ambulance is on the way. Keep her talking. Do you hear me?" Kayla whispered. "I'm here. Don't go quiet on me." Angela tried to answer, but the pain pushed sound out of her throat as nothing more than air. Her fingers clawed at the cot, reached for Kayla, and then gripped the blanket until her knuckles blanched. Sirens began as a distant smear of sound, then grew until red strobes flashed across the cracked windows. Paramedics moved with contained urgency, gloves on, questions short, eyes already calculating. Blood pressure. Pulse. Fetal tones. "She's in distress," one of them said, not unkindly, and then they were lifting, securing, moving with practiced rhythm. Kayla climbed into the ambulance without waiting for permission. No one stopped her. The doors slammed. The night cut off. Inside was a chaos of order, straps, monitors, the smell of plastic and oxygen, the wail of the siren pulling the world aside. Kayla held the rail with one hand and her mother's wrist with the other, counting beats against her fingertips like a private metronome. Angela's eyes fluttered, rolled, focused, lost focus. "Stay with me," Kayla said. "I've got you. You promised me you'd fight. Fight now." An oxygen mask went on. 4 lines slid in. The paramedic nearest them looked young and unshaven, a smudge of fatigue beneath each eye, but his hands were steady. "Mount Hope," he said to the driver. "Call ahead. NICU standby." The hospital swallowed them whole, sliding doors, bright light, movement in every direction. The stretcher rattled over thresholds and tile, past a wall of posters about handwashing and hope. Voices layered, BP dropping, get labs, notify OB, page anesthesia, until language itself turned into rhythm. Kayla trailed the stretcher until a nurse held an arm across her path. "You can't go in," the nurse said, then softened when she saw Kayla's face. "You can watch here." She guided Kayla to a narrow panel of glass, the kind that shows everything and nothing at once. Behind it, the room became a stage lit in relentless white. Angela lay under the surgical lamps, a blue drape already rising, wires climbing from her skin to machines that blinked and hissed. The baby's heart tones fluttered on a speaker, too fast, too thin. A doctor lifted a hand, and the team snapped to their marks. This wasn't drama, it was ritual. But the fear in the room was real. A footfall behind Kayla. She didn't turn. "If you're here to move me, don't." The silence answered in a familiar timbre. When she finally looked, Ethan Whitmore stood 6 feet back, tie unknotted, jacket open, a man who had jogged through rain and glass and tried to reach a door he couldn't open. He gave a small nod toward the interior. "They're prepped," he said, voice low. "I cleared the costs." "You cleared the costs," Kayla repeated, not quite trusting the words. "And if she dies, what will you clear then?" He didn't argue. His eyes returned to the glass. "I told them to do everything. They're doing it." A physician stepped out to the corridor, gloved and calm. "We're proceeding with an emergency delivery. The baby's oxygen levels are unstable, and the mother's blood pressure is critically low. We need to move now." He looked from Kayla to Ethan and back. "If there are any directives." "Save them," Kayla said. "Both." The doctor nodded once and vanished back through the door. The curtain of sound rolled on, the whine of suction, the clipped exchange of instruments, the steady, implacable beeping that measures the distance between a heartbeat and silence. Time stretched. The clock on the far wall clicked second by second with obscene indifference. Kayla pressed her palm to the glass until it smudged, until it hurt. She narrated to herself in a whisper because the mind needs a rope to hold. "Mom is here. Mom is strong. They're helping. The baby is fighting. This is not where it ends." On the other side of the glass, a nurse lifted a tiny form free. For a breathless moment the world narrowed to that space above the blue drape, to the newborn limp as a drowned leaf, to the way the doctor's hands moved with urgent tenderness. They rubbed, they suctioned, they coaxed. Nothing. The room leaned forward. The beeping mocked. The doctor lifted the baby, his palm firm between the small shoulder blades, and struck once, twice, 3 times. Silence. Then a sound rose, thin, torn, defiant. A cry, not larger than a thread, but a thread strong enough to pull the whole room back from the edge. The nurse wrapped the baby, placed the oxygen mask, spoke numbers that meant something to someone, and carried the child to a side station beneath a heat lamp. The baby cried again, stronger. The room exhaled. Kayla's legs buckled, the nurse beside her caught her by the elbow until she found her feet. Ethan's shoulders dropped an inch. Not victory, permission to breathe. But the mother's monitor disagreed. On the main table, Angela's heart rhythm stuttered. Blood pressure sank another step. The anesthetist adjusted a dial, the obstetrician bent closer, compressions began with a cadence that is both music and terror. The drape trembled with effort. The beeping changed. Kayla's breath snagged. "Mom," she whispered, useless against the glass. "Don't you go." Not now. Not after this. A code cart rolled in. Syringes flashed. The team traded places without chaos, the choreography of a fight that's been practiced too many times. The lead physician called out times. The charge nurse repeated them. The resident pressed down, down, down on the sternum with a desperate precision. Ethan pressed his fist to the frame of the window, the knuckles widening. His voice was meant for no one and everyone. Come on. Most people believe money is the shield that keeps disaster at arm's length. Nights like this tear that myth clean in half. If you want the truth when it arrives, don't miss it when it breaks the room open wide. Kayla forced herself to look, to witness. She refused to surrender her mother to a story told by other people. She mapped the bruises blooming on Angela's collarbone from compressions, counted the breaths forced in by a bagging mask, learned the rhythm of the defibrillator before it fired. She marked, without choosing to, the light above the table flickering as if it, too, was short on power. A nurse stepped out, face strained but steady. We have the baby stabilized. Low weight, but responsive. NICU is preparing a bed. Do you want to see? Not until she's okay, Kayla said, voice raw. Please. The nurse nodded, understanding exactly what the word please meant in a hallway like this, and went back inside. The compressions slowed. Another medication pushed. The heart monitor answered with an ugly, sinuous line. The physician looked up and met Ethan's gaze, a tiny, human moment through the glass that broke the distance between power and pleading. Then he turned back to the patient whose life didn't care about stock prices. Kayla's mind sprinted to the file. To the signatures. To the meetings in bright rooms where losses are measured in dollars and not in daughters. To the shelter's damp ceiling where hope molds fast. She felt the heat rise in her throat, anger and terror braided tight. If this story ended here, it would not end quietly. She spoke through the glass as if it were thin enough to hear. You fight. You hear me? You fight, because I'm not done. I'm not done getting us out. Ethan didn't lift his eyes from the room. They're not done either. The beeping flickered, the line tried to catch and slide into a rhythm. For an ecstatic second, it did. Then it faltered, lost it, fell back into uncertainty. The team adjusted. Another round. Another call. The resident's shoulders trembled with effort and kept going. Down the hall, a cleaner pushed a cart very slowly, eyes dropping as she passed, as if walking through a chapel where grief and hope were both in the pews. A man in a suit argued quietly with a billing clerk who kept repeating, "Sir, not now." The world continued its small, indifferent tasks. The room inside did not. Kayla pictured her mother's hands folding dough when she still had the strength to bake on Sundays, the way flour ghosted the air like snow. She pictured the rubber bands Angela kept on her wrist to tie off braids in the summer heat. She pictured the way her voice always rose on the last word when she said, "We'll make it." These weren't memories, they were anchors thrown ahead into a future Kayla refused to lose. Ethan's phone vibrated. He didn't check it. Somewhere, a board member was sending a message sharp enough to cut, about exposure, about liability, about containment. He let it buzz and die. Most people think the worst night of a life is the one that ends it. Sometimes it's the night that demands you choose who you are before the sun lets you pretend again. Stay here, because the next choice will redraw the lines between guilt and redemption. Inside, the compressions paused. The room held its breath while the monitor decided whether to sing or go silent. The lead physician leaned in, eyes on the screen, hand hovering over the chest that had carried a daughter through 17 hungry years. The line climbed, hesitated, then etched a fragile rhythm across the glass. The nurse called the number out loud, like a blessing disguised as data. No one cheered. The work kept moving, slower now, more careful. The obstetrician checked the incision, the anesthetist marked doses, the neonatal team conferred at the warmer with the small, furious cry that refused to stop. Kayla exhaled like she hadn't in minutes. She sagged against the wall, heat draining from her face so fast she felt faint. The nurse beside her pressed a paper cup of water into her hand. It shook violently. Half of it sloshed onto her shirt. "It's okay," the nurse said, and in that instant the word meant everything it could. Ethan opened his eyes. He hadn't realized he'd closed them. His fist left a pale dent in the paint that would outlast the night. He finally glanced down at his phone just long enough to silence it completely. The lead physician stepped out, mask hanging loose around his neck. He did not smile. But the set of his shoulders had changed. He spoke carefully, aware of the cliff still beneath them. "We have a pulse. It's weak, and she's not out of danger. We're transferring her to intensive care once we stabilize. The baby is breathing on her own with support. We'll take her to NICU now." "Can I?" Kayla's voice dissolved. She began again. "Can I see the baby for 1 second?" "Briefly," he said. "Then ICU will want you close by." He gestured, and the NICU nurse turned, lifting the corner of the blanket. Under the warmer's glow lay a tiny face wrinkled with effort, mouth opening and closing like a small engine determined not to stall. A wristband with Johnson, F, encircled an arm no bigger than a finger. Kayla pressed her palm to the glass as if touch could cross light and plastic. "Hi," she whispered, a word no one heard but the world. She stood straighter. "I'm right here." The nurse nodded once more and wheeled the warmer toward the elevator. The neonate's cry faded down the hall, replaced by the hum of machines returning to their baselines. Kayla looked back into the operating room. The drape came down. The lights dimmed one notch. The team thinned to essentials. It was not triumph. It was an arm wrestle paused at the brink. Ethan stepped closer but stopped a respectful distance away. "They'll move her soon," he said. "I'll have a car follow the NICU team with whatever they ask for." Kayla didn't thank him. Not yet. Gratitude was a currency she guarded the way he guarded secrets. She nodded once, the kind of nod that says we're not done. Through the glass, a nurse adjusted the blanket at Angela's shoulder. For an instant, her hand rested there, human and steady, then moved on to the next task. The monitor kept time, thin, stubborn, present. Kayla placed her own palm exactly where the nurse's had been, separated by inches and everything. "Fight," she said, softly, fiercely, forever. "We're not finished." And the night, which had started with a scream, held still long enough to let the word echo back. The ICU ward hummed like a fragile machine, its pulse a collection of steady beeps, sighing vents, and whispered footsteps on polished tile. Angela Johnson lay beneath a tangle of wires and tubes, her face pale, her chest rising only with the help of oxygen. The fight wasn't over, not by hours, not by days, but she was still here. Beside her bed, Kayla sat hunched forward, one hand gripping her mother's wrist, the other holding a hospital bassinet that cradled her newborn sister. The infant slept beneath a knit cap too large for her head, every breath shallow but determined. Kayla watched both of them with the same desperate intensity, refusing to blink in case time betrayed her. The door opened softly. Ethan Whitmore stepped inside, suit discarded for the first time anyone in the building could remember. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his hair damp, his face drawn. He looked less like a billionaire than a man stripped of armor. Kayla stiffened. "Why are you here?" He glanced at Angela, then at the baby, then back to Kayla. "Because I have to be." "No," Kayla snapped, her voice sharp despite the exhaustion in it. "You chose to be. Don't make it sound like fate." Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from her. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady beep of monitors. Then he said, "I read every page of that file again last night. And more. Records you didn't see." Angela wasn't just fired for blowing whistles. She uncovered contracts signed with my name. The experiments, the theft, the shortages, they were funded by divisions I approved. Kayla's stomach turned, though she had already suspected it. Hearing him confirm it made the air feel heavier, poisoned. "You knew," she accused. "No," Ethan said quickly, shaking his head. "I didn't. That's the truth I've been hiding from myself. I signed everything they put in front of me, chased growth, ignored the details. The empire I built wasn't clean. And your mother's suffering wasn't an accident, it was the cost of my success." The words dropped like stones into water, ripples spreading until the silence itself trembled. Kayla looked at her mother, then back at the man whose wealth had carried hospitals and destroyed them in the same breath. "So what now?" she whispered. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "Now, I burn it. The files, the contracts, the board, they'll fight me. But I'll tear this down brick by brick until it can't hurt another family again." Kayla searched his face for lies. All she saw was exhaustion, guilt, and a flicker of something else, resolve. "You'll lose everything," she said. "I already have," he replied. His eyes moved to Angela, then to the baby. "I just didn't realize it until now. Most people believe redemption comes without sacrifice. It doesn't. It demands the empire you've built, the pride you've clung to, the illusions you've worshipped. If you don't want to miss the cost when truth finally collects its debt, stay here, because stories like this aren't fiction, they're warnings." 2 days later, the board gathered again. But this time, Ethan didn't come to defend. He came to confess. He laid the file on the long table, every page visible, every signature traced back to their hands and his. The directors shifted uneasily, but Ethan didn't flinch. He told them the story of Angela Johnson, a nurse discarded for daring to speak. He told them of her daughter, who had carried the truth through storms and shadows until it landed on his desk. "This empire was built on silence," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I won't carry it anymore. If that means I walk out of here with nothing, then so be it. At least I'll walk out as a man, not a shadow." Victor Hale's face hardened, but he said nothing. The rest of the board murmured, calculating, already imagining how to cut him loose while saving themselves. But Ethan didn't wait for their verdict. He left the folder on the table and walked out, the sound of the door closing louder than any gavel. At the hospital, Kayla watched her mother stir for the first time in days. Angela's eyes opened slowly, clouded but alive. Her lips parted, forming a sound that barely reached above a whisper. Kayla leaned close, catching the single word. "Baby." Kayla lifted the tiny bundle from the bassinet and held her close enough for Angela to see. The infant yawned, stretching a fist in the air, her cry thin but steady. Angela's eyes softened, tears slipping free. Her hand lifted weakly, brushing against Kayla's cheek. "You did this," she whispered. Kayla shook her head, tears spilling hot. "No. You did. You fought. You never stopped fighting." Angela smiled faintly before sleep pulled her back under, her hand still resting on her daughter's arm. Kayla stayed there long after, her heart steady for the first time in months. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, they were together. Alive. Ethan stood outside the door, unseen, listening. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the architect of something vast. He felt like a witness, someone allowed to stand near the truth, even if it broke him. Wealth will tell you that survival is numbers. But nights like this prove survival is names: Angela, Kayla, Faith, written in hearts instead of ledgers. Subscribe now, because the names that matter most are often the ones hidden by power. Months later, Ethan's towers still stood, but his name had vanished from their glass. Lawsuits buried the board. Investigations bled the company dry. Ethan sold his stake, donated the proceeds to the same shelters where Kayla and Angela had once slept. The press painted him as a fallen king. Kayla didn't care. For her, the empire's ashes were proof that truth still burned hotter than wealth. She walked the halls of the hospital carrying her sister, now stronger, louder, refusing to be ignored. Nurses smiled at the sight, unaware of the war fought to make it possible. Angela wheeled beside her, thin but recovering, her hand never far from her daughter's. Kayla paused outside a window one evening, the city lights sprawling beyond. She whispered to the baby in her arms, the words her mother once told her, "We'll make it." And for the first time, she believed it. Because the painful truth had been dragged into the light, and it hadn't destroyed them. It had set them free.